What if the greatest band in the world was built on a knife-point threat? Ginger Baker nearly drove off the road when Eric Clapton demanded Jack Bruce, his most bitter enemy, as their bass player. They formed anyway. Then, at their absolute peak, one scathing review sent Clapton to the floor of a restaurant and ended it all. They walked off the stage without a word to each other. This is the rise and fall of Cream. London, 1966. The British blues boom was in full swing, and Eric Clapton was already at the top. Not a rising star, not a promising talent. At the peak. The graffiti had appeared on walls across the city, Clapton is God, and the music world accepted it as a reasonable statement of fact. His playing with John Mayall's Blues Breakers had set a new standard for emotional depth and technical precision. But Clapton was restless. The Blues Breakers were a great band. They just weren't big enough for what he was hearing inside his head. Ginger Baker was restless too. As the drummer for the Graham Bond organization, Baker had already established himself as something apart from every other drummer in England. Jazz-trained, ferociously intense, he was one of the first rock drummers to popularize the double bass drum kit, a setup that gave him a rhythmic complexity few others could match. But Graham Bond's drug use and declining mental health were tearing the band apart, and Baker had been watching Clapton from a distance, recognizing something in him that matched his own fierce ambition. In early 1966, Baker drove to Clapton's home and made his pitch: leave Mayall, form something new, something that had never existed before. Clapton agreed, but with one condition. He wanted Jack Bruce. The color drained from Baker's face. Baker and Bruce had played together in the Graham Bond organization, and what they shared was not camaraderie. It was war. Physical fights. Sabotaged equipment. Baker had fired Bruce from that band, and Bruce had kept showing up to gigs anyway, until Baker, by some accounts, threatened him at knifepoint on a London street. These were not two men who needed to be placed back in the same room. Before we continue, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. But Clapton held firm. Jack Bruce was a classically trained cellist, a jazz aficionado, and a bass player who played his instrument like a lead guitar. Nobody else came close. Baker gritted his teeth and said yes. The three of them met at Baker's home to rehearse, and what happened in that room shook all three of them. The musical chemistry was instantaneous and almost frightening. They chose the name Cream as a statement of confidence. They believed they were the cream of the crop among British musicians. What none of them understood yet was that they had just built a magnificent engine, powered by rivalry, running on friction, and with no way to shut it off. Cream made their public debut at the Windsor Jazz and Blues Festival in July 1966, and the audience did not know what hit them. The sheer volume, the interplay, the absolute refusal to follow any formula that had come before, it announced immediately that something had fundamentally changed in rock music. Their debut album, Fresh Cream, arrived in December 1966 and showed two distinct faces of the band: blues covers that honored their roots, and original compositions that pointed towards something altogether new. But it was America that would define them, and America came calling in the spring of 1967. Their first American dates were not glamorous. Booked for a multi-act bill in New York, they were often limited to short, tightly restricted sets. It was humiliating for three men of their stature. But while they were in New York, something extraordinary happened. They were brought into a studio where they began working with producer Felix Pappalardi and engineer Tom Dowd on what would become their second album, Disraeli Gears. Pappalardi understood them immediately. He recognized that beneath the volume and the improvisation, there were actual songs, melodies, and ideas that could be shaped without being suffocated. He guided the band toward a psychedelic blues fusion that honored their roots while opening a door to something genuinely new. The title of the album itself told the story. A roadie had mispronounced derailleur gears, Clapton laughed, and suddenly they had a name that sounded like a 19th century British prime minister. It was a band who didn't take themselves too seriously, even as they were quietly changing everything. Disraeli Gears was released in November 1967, and it hit like a thunderbolt. The production was vivid and psychedelic. The songwriting was tighter than anything they had done before. And buried inside it was the song that would define a generation and rewrite the rules of rock radio. Sunshine of Your Love was born from a late-night session between Jack Bruce and lyricist Pete Brown after Clapton and Bruce had attended a Jimi Hendrix concert. Inspired and electric from what they had witnessed, Bruce sat down in the early hours of the morning and worked through a descending riff that was simultaneously bluesy and heavy, ancient and utterly modern. The song almost didn't make the album. The head of their record label reportedly dismissed it as uncommercial noise. The band pushed back, fought for the track, and won. By the spring of 1968, Sunshine of Your Love had climbed to number 5 on the American Billboard charts. Radio programmers who had been cautious about the band's blues roots suddenly understood that something unprecedented had arrived. The song didn't just succeed, it rewired what American listeners expected from a rock band. The riff was heavy in a way that hadn't quite existed before. The groove was relentless and hypnotic. And the interplay between Bruce's bass, Baker's drums, and Clapton's singing guitar established a rhythmic and tonal language that would influence every hard rock band that followed. Cream was now a phenomenon. They sold out venues the Beatles had played, they appeared on American television, their faces covered magazines that had never cared about blues music before. And they accomplished all of it not through polished pop songwriting or industry promotion, but through raw, improvised power and musical authority. Their live shows had become something unto themselves. A song that ran 3 minutes on an album could expand to 20 minutes on stage as Bruce, Clapton, and Baker pushed against each other in real time. It wasn't always harmonious, but it was always extraordinary. The Fillmore in San Francisco became their cathedral. Night after night, audiences stood with their mouths open, not entirely certain whether they were watching musicians collaborate or watching 3 men wage an argument that happened to sound like the future of music. It was both, and for a brief, brilliant window of time, the argument produced something that sounded very much like genius. By 1968, Cream occupied a position in rock music that no band had held before. Their third release, Wheels of Fire, became one of the first platinum-selling double albums in rock history. One disc was recorded in the studio, the other captured their live performances from San Francisco, a 16-minute version of Spoonful, and a blazing reinvention of Robert Johnson's Crossroad Blues that Clapton played at a ferocious, almost desperate tempo. The album hit number 1 in the United States. Cream was the biggest rock band on the planet. They headlined arenas from coast to coast, playing the Philadelphia Spectrum and Madison Square Garden, surrounded by the towering Marshall stacks that had become their calling card. The walls of amplifiers were not just equipment, they were a declaration. We will fill whatever room you put us in. But Ginger Baker was not celebrating. Positioned at his drum kit between the amplifier stacks of Bruce and Clapton, Baker described that final year of performing as extremely painful. The volume had grown so overwhelming that the musicians could barely hear one another. Communication, the very element that had made their live performances astonishing, was quietly disintegrating. Baker later alleged that he and Clapton actually stopped playing entirely for 2 full choruses during one performance, simply to determine whether Bruce would notice. According to Baker, the bass player was so absorbed in his own playing that he did not register their absence at all. That image tells the entire story. 3 musicians on the same stage, in the same band, inhabiting completely different worlds. The relationship between Bruce and Baker had never healed from the Graham Bond years, and the extraordinary success had done nothing to mellow either man. Off stage, they barely exchanged words. On stage, their competition had shifted from the personal to the sonic, each pushing to dominate through volume and technical ambition. Clapton, perpetually caught in the crossfire, had begun to quietly withdraw. He still played brilliantly, because he was constitutionally incapable of doing otherwise. But the fire behind his eyes had started to dim. Something was coming. Everybody in that inner circle could feel it. They just didn't know yet what form the end would take. The blow that finally broke Eric Clapton came not from within the band, it came from a magazine. In May 1968, Rolling Stone published a review by critic John Landau of a Cream concert in Boston. Landau was merciless. He described the performances as boring and repetitious, accused Clapton of relying on one-dimensional blues cliches, and suggested the band was doing nothing more than showing off. It was the kind of review that might have bounced harmlessly off a lesser ego. But Clapton was not armored by arrogance. He was armored by perfectionism. And perfectionism makes a man profoundly vulnerable to the precise criticism that touches the thing he fears most about himself. He was deeply shaken when he read the review. When he came to terms with it, something had shifted. The ring of truth in Landau's words, as Clapton later described it, forced him to question everything Cream was doing. Were they creating art, or were they simply performing? The distinction had begun to matter enormously to him, and the answer he arrived at was devastating. Then came the moment that sealed it. A friend placed a copy of music from Big Pink on the turntable, the debut album from a group called The Band. The sound that came out of the speakers was everything Cream was not. Understated, collaborative, deeply rooted in American folk and country, built around songs rather than solos. Where Cream filled arenas with volume, the band whispered truths in small rooms. Where Cream competed, the band listened to one another. Clapton later reflected that hearing the band made him feel he was in the wrong place, with the wrong people doing the wrong thing. The legend holds that his first instinct was to travel to Woodstock and simply ask if he could join them. He never worked up the nerve to make that call, but the desire said everything about where he had arrived. By mid-1968, the decision had been made. Cream would disband. They were at the absolute height of their commercial power, the arenas were still full, the records still selling, and they chose to walk away. Not because the money had dried up, not because the audiences had abandoned them, but because the music, the thing that had brought all three of them together in the first place, had stopped meaning what it once meant. The announcement hit the music world like a shockwave. Nobody walked away when they were on top. Nobody. But Cream did, and in doing so, they established a rare example of a band walking away at its commercial peak, even as the industry had never quite seen it, and has rarely witnessed since. Management and the record label persuaded them to honor their commitments, a farewell tour of 22 American shows, followed by 2 final nights at the Royal Albert Hall in London. The tour sold out everywhere it played. The audiences who packed those arenas understood they were watching something that would never exist again, and the performances reflected that awareness. Even fractured, even cold toward each other, Cream played those shows with the full force of everything they had ever been. The Royal Albert Hall concerts on November 25th and 26th of 1968 were filmed and became the band's final visual document. Opening acts reportedly included a young band called Yes and Rory Gallagher's Taste, 2 groups who had learned almost everything they knew from watching Cream. When the final note sounded on that second night, there were no speeches, no group embrace, no acknowledgement of the thing they had built together over those extraordinary 30 months. As Clapton later recalled, they simply walked off the stage and away from each other. The final album, Goodbye, was released in February 1969. It contained 3 live tracks and 3 new studio recordings. The most enduring of those studio cuts was Badge, co-written by Clapton and his friend George Harrison, who appeared on the recording under the pseudonym Leangelo Misterioso as a quiet return of favor for Clapton having played lead guitar on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. The title itself came from a misreading of Harrison's handwriting. He had written Bridge to indicate a musical passage, and Clapton misread it as Badge and simply preferred the sound of it. Goodbye hit number 1 in the United Kingdom and number 2 in the United States. Even in dissolution, Cream was untouchable. In the aftermath, each member pursued the musical life that the constant friction had denied them. Clapton and Baker briefly reunited with Steve Winwood in Blind Faith, a band that lasted 1 album before the combustible chemistry reasserted itself all over again. Bruce threw himself into a prolific solo career, releasing the critically acclaimed Songs for a Tailor and exploring jazz rock territory that showcased the full depth of his remarkable musicianship. Clapton eventually found the collaborative piece he had been searching for in Derek and the Dominoes, where he recorded Layla and other assorted love songs, a masterpiece born from heartbreak, and finally, from something resembling genuine partnership. Cream existed for just over 2 years. In that time, they helped define and popularize the power trio as a viable vehicle for serious rock music. They established the Marshall stack as an instrument of artistic expression rather than simply a tool of amplification. They transformed the concert from a polished performance of well-rehearsed hits into an improvisational event built on spontaneous musical conversation. They pushed the blues tradition through a filter of volume and ambition and produced something that nobody had a name for yet, but that everybody recognized the moment they heard it. And they proved, in the most painful way imaginable, that genius and harmony are not the same thing and do not require each other to survive. Their shadow fell across everything that followed. Led Zeppelin took the Cream blueprint of blues, transmuted into something heavier, and built an empire on it. Black Sabbath's Geezer Butler cited Jack Bruce as the reason he understood that a bass guitar could carry as much weight as any lead instrument. Rush built their entire artistic identity around the power trio format that Cream had helped popularize. The influence reached all the way forward to Nirvana, 3 musicians, maximum impact, no excess, no apology. Every generation of rock musicians since has been playing inside an architecture that Cream helped design. In 1993, the members came together long enough to accept their induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The ceremony was dignified, the smiles were cautious. In 2005, they reunited for 4 shows at the Royal Albert Hall, then followed with 3 nights at Madison Square Garden. The London performances were received as a genuine triumph, a reminder of what these 3 men had been capable of together. The New York shows were shadowed by the same tensions that had undone them in 1968. Baker and Bruce resumed fighting almost immediately over the volume of the bass on stage. Any talk of a longer reunion quickly faded. Some things, it seemed, did not change. Jack Bruce died in 2014. Ginger Baker followed in 2019. With their passing, any remaining possibility of another reunion became something else entirely. A permanent entry in the long ledger of what rock music lost before its time. What Cream left behind was not simply a catalog of extraordinary songs, though those songs were extraordinary. What they left behind was proof that the most volatile combinations sometimes produce the most enduring fire. 3 men who had no real business being in the same room together built a sound that permanently reshaped music's architecture. The friction that ultimately destroyed them was the same friction that had forged them. And the music they made in that brief, impossible window, music that was born from rivalry and stubbornness and sheer refusal to back down, has outlasted every argument, every grievance, and every silence between them. Cream burned for barely 2 years, but the fire they set never went out. They gave rock music its architecture, the power trio, the extended jam, the Marshall stack, the idea that virtuosity itself was storytelling. 3 legends, 1 impossible band, a sound still echoing in everything you hear on classic rock radio today. What's your memory of Cream? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories from rock's golden era.